Yeah, welcome everyone to this live stream, which is actually the last one we're having in this part one of CTM Festival 2022. My name is Jan Rohlf. I'm one of the organizers of the festival. And for today, we have invited Eleni Ikoniadou and Jonathan Chaim Reus, whom I like to welcome warmly, to engage in a conversation that is meant to give some insights into the latest production within our series, Kontinuum. And Kontinuum is a yearly call for works that we publish together with the German national broadcaster Deutschlandfunk Kultur, respectively their weekly sound art program Klangkunst. The call is now in its third year, and it's situated within a larger project that we call the CTM Radiolab. The Radiolab exists since 2014, and it invites sound artists to come up with new ideas to experiment with the medium of radio, all the while exploring and connecting to the specific artistic possibilities of two largely different environments, which are a live music festival, such as CTM Festival, and a radio station. So the Radiolab is a joint effort by Deutschlandfunk Kultur and CTM Festival, together with partners, the ORF Ö1 Kunstradio, the ORF Musikprotokoll im Steirischen Herbst, Goethe-Institut, and the Wire magazine. And each year, the productions produced for the Radiolab are presented in various forms on several of the platforms of these partners. In the case of Kontinuum, the request that we put out to the artists via the open call was, I would say, more specific and probably even more challenging than for the general Radiolab call that we do. The task here was to propose a concept for a generative audio stream to be played 24/7, 365 days all through the year, offering a singular audio channel to be continuously modulated. And this Kontinuum stream will be featured throughout 2022 on Deutschlandfunk Kultur and on the Ö1 Kunstradio program. That is, whenever there's a gap in the schedule, then we will switch to the Kontinuum stream to break away from news, music, and other parts of the radio program onto that different but ever-present sonic reality that is the Kontinuum stream. And in case of this year's winning project, In Search of Good Ancestors, Ahnen in Arbeit by Jonathan Chaim Reus, the stream will also exist, and actually does already exist, on a dedicated web platform that has been launched today and will be accessible throughout 2022 at all times under the URL ahnen.in. So before Jonathan and Eleni will take you to the ideas of long-term thinking and intergenerational responsibility that inform the artwork and will shed some light on the technologies and the processes behind, let me briefly introduce our guests. So we have Eleni Ikoniadou. She's a researcher and an author, and currently reader in digital culture and sonic arts at the Royal College of Art in London. She is also a member of the art group Arbeit In with Steve Goodman, aka Code 9, and Toby Hayes. And her research sits at the intersection of art theory and technoculture with a specific attention to sound and the voice. And in her very recent research, she is also investigating into machine learning in art, music, and the culture industries. And all of this makes her, of course, a very well-fitting or perfect conversation partner to discuss Jonathan Chaim Reus' new work, in which sound, machine learning, artificial voices, and theory all play a major part. Jonathan Chaim Reus is a media artist, performer, musician, coder, theorist, and composer, originally from the US, but living in The Hague in the Netherlands since a long time. And in his interdisciplinary works, the poetic implications and the political implications of technology are often investigated. He is also active as a community organizer in arts and music, being a founder of the nonprofit cultural initiative III in The Hague, and also of the platform for thought in motion. Yeah, and so I'm personally really curious how this work will evolve throughout the coming months. And actually, everyone interested in the project is invited to contribute to shaping it. And that is through contributions that you can make via the website and through participating in a series of workshops that Jonathan will host together with the Arts and Technology Collective Varia. We will have a workshop in March and then a second one in May during our part 2 of CTM Festival here in Berlin. And the third workshop will be in November. You will find all information about that on our festival website, ctm-festival.de. Yeah, and of course you can contribute also to today's talk. We are happy to take your questions and comments via our YouTube chat, and then we'll pass them on to our speakers. But enough from me. It's time to switch to our guests. Eleni and Jonathan, welcome once again, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jan. Hi, John.
Hi, Eleni. Good
Nice
to see you again.
We're going to pretend that we're sitting across a table, maybe, and have a nice conversation like that. I wish we could do it. We could do it like that, in fact, because there is, I'm so used to this Zoom life and online life, but there's also something nice about proximity. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But without further ado, I would like to say a little bit about your project. Thank you for inviting me to converse with you and what I hope will be.
Thank you for being here.
I'm sure we'll have. I'm sure it's the first of many conversations. Now that we met, shout out to Aphrodite Psara for connecting us, and congratulations on winning Kontinuum 2022.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor, actually. CTM has always been one of my favorite music festivals, and it's a bit of it's a bit humbling to be able to take the stage on this platform and to be able to talk with you also, because I've been, sort of admiring your work from afar. And now that, I'm also doing a PhD in the UK, so I'm half in the Netherlands, half in the UK. I am very much hoping that we can keep this conversation going and hopefully at some point really meet in person to have a conversation.
Yes, we'll aim to do that. But this brilliant project that that is just launching today, In Search of Good Ancestors, Ahnen in Arbeit, is a year-long experiment in generative radio. So if I can say a bit about the project shall I introduce that before we start?
Please do.
An artificial broadcaster, a bespoke voice synthesis system utilizing current deep learning techniques in voice synthesis and style transfer, shifts through speech and song, words and soundscapes, reading through text as if tracing slowly over the letters, probing them and unsettling them. Through the year, the broadcaster performs words produced by predictive processes, beginning with a small set of texts, including virologist Jonas Solks's 1977 speech, Are We Being Good Ancestors?, and growing its knowledge throughout the year by a series of public workshops. The broadcaster tries to predict what words should come next at any given time, based on its previous and current memory. Ideas of long-term thinking, wrapped up in human activities of prediction, risk analysis, and adaptation happen at many levels of society and individual consciousness. What does it mean to be a good ancestor? And what kind of cultural memories will be left within the algorithmic, AI-entangled writing systems of today? These are your questions through this project. And there's so much that we have to talk about, but I wonder if we should start a little bit with intergenerational ideas, thinking behind that, and tease it out a little bit more. I was thinking when when you because we had a few conversations before this, and I was thinking about intergenerational as something that it brings to light the significance of slow and long and relational phenomena, as I think the project does, and the capacity to coexist across time, and to take responsibility for it. Putting the collective, perhaps, community, things like, interdependence above the notion of the individual and the self. And this seems particularly important as an antidote to the decaying empire of the West. And indeed, for other cultures and other peoples and places, it's an informal ancient practice, a way of living, right? So I'm gearing up to a question or two, if you bear with me. But I was thinking of this article I read about what motivates intergenerational practices in South Africa. Jacob Hoffman, where he quotes the Zulu phrase "Umuntu numuntu nabantu," which means "I am because we are." So, this idea that a person is a person because of other people. And of course, not to romanticize or fail to recognize kind of the changing fabric of a society under settler colonialism and apartheid and industrialization, globalization, etc. But maybe integral in our search for good ancestors are these ideas about indigenous futures, ways of repair, the failure of imagination, as Lola Olufami calls it, which circulate more and more, I think, especially through the last couple of years of a pandemic, which has made people rethink a lot of things. So, I wanted to hear your thoughts on defining this intergenerational thinking in relation to these other ways of being and doing, if you wish, and B, also this question of who or what is potentially included in this ancestral search. This because there is, I'm sure in this project there's the intergenerational, as in the aforementioned South African practices, it does not only involve those who are physically alive, but also those who are departed, of course, their ancestors, as well as those yet to be born. And here we could include all kinds of things, that are non-human ancestors, for example. And in your case, you're dealing with your work. There is the AI. So I'm thinking not just of the importance of the others as different cultural and non-historical paradigms, but also of otherworldliness, embedded in the intergenerational. I'm sorry if this is too long.
Oh my God, there are so many things in there.
Pick up what you like. Over to you.
Oh yeah, what should I even start with there? Yeah, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is because you were mentioning Africa, South Africa, and I was I think the last big project I've done before this one was kind of tracing the history of the American banjo. I'm a banjo player. And the banjo has a really crazy history that I guess a lot of people know about in the US, and I guess increasingly know about in Europe. But I mean, the banjo is kind of like this, almost like this blueprint of colonial racism. But is also like quite a complex thing, because it complicates these like kind of romanticized ideas that we might have about, let's say, what an ancestral culture is or what a traditional culture is, because the kind of the common cultural imagination, even still today, I would say, people think of the banjo as like this kind of like white hillbilly instrument. Actually, I mean, originally, if you trace the lineage of the instrument back, it comes from slave plantations, and then previously from the West Indies, and then previously to that from Africa. And it's this kind of like crazy amalgamation of a lot of different instrumental ideas, musical ideas, ingenuity and experimentation, but also just, survival and whatever you had around. So you can kind of recognize that. But at the same time, you have like people in the Appalachian Mountains, for example, who like white people in the Appalachian Mountains who have played the banjo songs for generations. And these songs have been passed down from generation to generation. People learn them from their parents or from their cousins or whatever. So that's a really complex idea of lineage, right? Because these ideas of who owns what kind of break down a little bit, at least in terms of our kind of like the categorization systems that we want to throw on them. So this is something that comes to my mind a lot. This kind of example when I start thinking about things like lineage. It's also a bit of a personal thing because I myself like don't really have such a strong sense of lineage. I mean, I'm like second generation immigrant from the United States. I don't really know my family. I know I have a grandmother who was Indonesian. My mother's side of the family were Jews from like Poland or Russia or who knows where. And I wasn't really raised with any specific tradition. I was just raised with like kind of American culture, which is also itself kind of a grab bag, So I really identify with a couple of ideas. One from Jonas Salk, this essay that's kind of serving as like the initial conditions, let's say, of the prediction algorithm. And he makes a statement. He says that in the West, we can choose our ancestors. And I think what he means by this, at least the way I identify with that, is that there's kind of like an orphanhood to being in this kind of like post-colonial world that we live in. We're all kind of, at least for me, being in the States and, being kind of from a lot of different immigrant lineages, it's kind of like where do you look for predecessors? And those things are not immediately given, at least weren't to me. So I tend to try to just choose the best ideas I can from what I can find, the ones that resonate the most with me, the ones that I want to kind of push forward. And this is kind of like my personal connection to ancestorship. And it's mirrored very strongly in because when I was doing this banjo project, I went to Ghana. So this is kind of like, if you really want to trace the history of the banjo all the way back to the African continent, you would probably go to Ghana, or maybe you would go to Senegal or Gambia. And in Ghana, I had the opportunity to meet a lot of really incredible artists and musicians. One of them was this legendary high life guitarist named Kunimo. And he, in Ghana, there's, especially the Ashanti region of Ghana, there's this kind of historic symbol system for capturing certain kinds of spiritual or community knowledge. It's called the Adinkra symbol system. And there's one really famous symbol, which is called Sankofa, which is usually illustrated by a bird that's walking forward while looking backwards and carrying an egg in its mouth. And usually this symbol is kind of, at least in the United States, when you hear about it, it's usually said as like, oh yeah, don't forget about the past, or go back and grab things from the past. But when I met Kunimo, he gave me a really wonderful explanation of Sankofa. He said that Sankofa is carefully choosing the best practices from the past in order to bring them forward into the future. And there's always this process of kind of negotiating what is good to take forward and what is best to leave behind. And it's not a set thing. This Sankofa is always in motion. So that got me thinking a lot about, well, yeah, maybe I do choose the lineages that I want to build upon, but it's always a kind of tending process or a caring process. And I think that really is a process that I bring to this project, because I see these algorithms as something that maybe we can dance with or have a dialogue with, and maybe do it in a kind of a community oriented way. I mean, I come from like kind of a folk music background, so I'm used to like people getting together and sharing things and building things together. And I guess I'm just thinking a little bit in terms of like what the digital media equivalent of that would be, or how to bring those practices into a digital media practice. So I don't know.
Right. Yes.
I just tried to grab whatever I could out of that.
And you did. You really
said.
did. That's exactly where I was heading. That idea of the dance with others, and that kind of the idea of the collective, right, which is at the core of the intergenerational. That doesn't only include our actual ancestors, because presumably, like I might want to forget my actual ancestors. I might be ashamed of my of my ancestors, or
Sure.
I'm sure a lot of people are, or not know, like you said, or we're not one thing. We don't come from one thing, but also the wisdom of the ancestors is interesting. But I was thinking when I was reading that article that you sent me, looking for good ancestors, I was thinking that if anything, the biggest pool of ancestors we probably have and can point to are bacteria. Like these are the real ancestors. So it's not this anthropocentric idea, this Anthropocene idea that we kind of we make the earth, we make the world, we rule the world, we pass on from generation to generation, is also, I think, nicely problematized through your project, because it is about a long song. I was thinking of it as a long song, but it's interesting that you said a dance with other things, and to whom knows what, to this kind of open-ended future, but without this idea being about celebrating the technology, not that kind of simplistic thing of the technophile, or the opposite of that, the masters and the slaves, again, but the man and the machine, but more complicated, as in the collective. And and maybe we also come together through our love of music and choruses and choirs and collectives
and folk music, I think, also. And folk music as well, yeah.
Yes.
Because I mean, what initially drew me to your work was through this project that you did on the laments in Greece, and kind of bringing this folk tradition into a kind of encounter with machine learning processes. I don't know. I mean, would you want to give a little bit of background on that, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, since it is the thing that brought us together, yes, I was interested in.
Well, when I heard you were working on this, I was like, oh wow, so she's bringing together kind of like folk traditions and kind of using them to question technological structures. I'm just like, please, I want to meet this person.
I think you describe it much better than I could, and actually, bring some significance to it that maybe I didn't even think about in that conscious way. I was awarded in early 2020 funding by the EPSRC Human Data Interaction Network for an art project called Polyphonic Intelligence. And originally, I was interested in ideas of the chorus more than anything, the collective and the chorus, and the voice, of course, and the role of the voice in the chorus. And originally, I intended it to be this performance with human and non-human actors, and presented as a live event somewhere. And then the pandemic happened, of course, and the conditions changed, and suddenly it had to be something completely different. So I put out a call for professional mourners and artists and singers, musicians, to participate by contributing laments from a distance. And there was a process of actually sending a Zoom a portable recorder from house to house, and so there was something nice and kind of weird in this kind of socially distanced way of, so a collective and a chorus that never met, actually, that never occupied the same space and time, and then we got this beautiful audio database, and with the help of a programmer, we used it to create a new artificial voice that was never heard before. And I was interested in what that could be. And lamenting here was taken very loosely as an expression of sorrow. I thought it was very appropriate that we were going through a pandemic with kind of different expressions of sorrow. It felt like a collective grief in many ways, and an endless kind of lamentation. So also this idea of kind of something that builds up slowly and never ends, as in the situation we're in. With this pandemic. So, but I was also interested in non-linguistic ideas, So there was animal sounds and animal laments, the lament of a cello, and so on. And so this new voice was created, and then I had to kind of present it somehow to the public, again within a pandemic, again with kind of not knowing if things can go ahead live or not, and how to do this, and ended up asking some selected musicians to make a mix of the audio with all the raw materials, which was the actual lamenting of the performers. There was the voice that was the new voice that was created, these were the two key things. And that's a record. The result is Future Chorus, which is an album released this spring on vinyl. But in the midst of all this, and I was thinking also what would happen to things like this very intimate and personal, human, ritualistic, spiritual, very emotionally heavy things like lamenting. What would happen if you outsourced it to a technology? Also, partly because my research into lamenting in Greece, in other cultures too, but my focus was in Greece. It was interesting because, to experience lamenting in Greece with this which is a woman's job, and to experience this kind of chorus of women lamenting, and having a primary lamenter, and then having the chorus that feeds the primary lamenter with kind of data in real time, and that it's like almost a machinic process. It's really interesting to see. It's improvised. But it's so fast in its improvisation, and it's super experimental. And
is it always an ensemble? Is it always an ensemble that does? Is it always an ensemble that does the lament?
I mean, in the examples that are the main examples that I looked at, and I was interested in the polyphonic lament, which is from Epirus, which is a specific part in Greece, which is it's mostly polyphonic. So it is an ensemble, and what would happen to these things in the future, maybe or the future ancestors, looking at this present moment that we're undergoing, which is a moment of grief and of lamentation, that maybe is looked at differently from the standpoint of the future. So these were the driving ideas, anyway.
There is something for me very I mean that's why I think it's a brilliant project, and there's something for me that connects voice with ideas of death,
yes,
on many in many dimensions, especially artificial voice, because it is so much this kind of like spirit of someone who's absent. I mean, like, I think Edison was even making the claim that he was able to allow people to speak to their dead relatives when they were producing the gramophone. And I think about this a lot also with voice synthesis, especially the kind of voice synthesis that's becoming very available now that I use in this project, even where you can quite easily copy somebody's vocal signature, which has been possible for decades actually. But I mean, machine learning systems allow you to do it with very little specialist knowledge. So this idea that you can like capture somebody's voice in an algorithm, right? It's not a recording, right? It's something like a recording, but it's not a recording. That I find really interesting. I find that a lot more provocative than the fact that my Facebook profile will probably be there after I die. Somehow that my voice is floating around after I die, because I mean, for this project, I'm using reasonably available algorithms, and with, you know, a few minutes of a voice, I can produce something that reasonably sounds like that person. And I wonder, you know, for me, because I've never really been attracted to sort of deep learning as a synthesis technique, except with voice. And I'm always wondering, because there's always something that attracts me to a technology, because there's something a little bit more, let's say, like earthy or spiritual going on. And I wonder if this is what attracts me to voice, and maybe something that also maybe attracted you to voice is this like connection with to death, to absence.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, at the risk of a plug, I wasn't planning on mentioning, but this is but this is what started it all. This is the book Unsound, Undead that we did with Odin. We edited, which was all about the relationship between sound and death. And
okay.
I wrote. It's all coming together. You're very intuitively correct.
That was the smoothest plug I could ever imagine.
I wasn't planning on it. It's long in the past already, but this is when I first wrote about the lament. I wrote a kind of a poetic, you know, it's not an academic book. It's a bit of a weirder, you know, more an art book. And I wrote a poetic text on the lament because of the relation between voice and women's voices, in particular to death. You know, because the lamenter, of course, is invested very much in the deceased. It's an ancient thing, right? It's invested in the deceased passing on to the underworld. And in fact, that's the role of the lamenter. Through her voice, she opens a portal almost, and, you know, connects the two worlds, this and the next.
I wonder, could we listen? I know we have some recordings we could listen to. Could we listen to maybe a recording of the lament?
Yeah, I was thinking maybe, I don't. Did you mean one of the laments, like the Irish lament? That's on the list.
Or whichever one you would like to. Whichever one you think fits the mood.
We could listen a little bit of the. We've got numbers. We're very organized, and we've got numbers. Let me find number. Oh, didn't I send the erotic lament? It's not on the list. Oh, okay.
Oh, that one.
We're not
that one I can get.
I'm sorry. But we could listen to some of the keening by Ruth McGill, or should we listen to the generated voice that was made out of the lamenting? I don't know.
Maybe a little bit of both?
Okay, a little bit of both. Yeah, just a little bit, because it's, yeah, please. Oh, we didn't say number, did we? Number 1, please. It's a. Can I talk over it? I think that makes sense to talk over it now. Oh, it's done. Okay. This is. Can you hear me if I talk over it? Yes. Yeah, I think that's nice to talk over this. Actually, it's a really nice background. So this was Ruth McGill, Irish keening, but I was sure I had on the list a polyphonic lament, which is very exciting. But while you were talking before, maybe we don't have to listen to it anymore. But while you were talking before, yeah, maybe we can play actually a little bit, please, of number 2. But be careful because the start of it is quite sudden. I think maybe there we go. So this is, thank you, that's great. So this is an early sample, like a 5-minute sample for first sample of the generated voice. And before when you were talking about language, of course voice in the West is language, right? From the ancient Greeks, there is a very tight connection between voice and language. We know from Heidegger by Aristotle that man is a political animal because he's a speaking animal, a being which has language, which addresses and discusses its world. And the Greeks also really looked down on voice without speech, and warned against it as irrational and dangerous. And usually these are female voices, as we know from the sirens and from all kinds of other creatures, or animal and non-human vocal emissions that would jeopardize man's search for harmony and truth. Which is quite a patriarchal view of that. I think passes on, even to today about what language is. And when I first heard this voice that we just played, I thought this is super interesting because this voice is trained on, English speaking. Of course, there were animal sounds, there were cello sounds, as I said, and text and all kinds of things, but mostly English speaking. Data sets, and it's still it kind of refuses to speak that language. That is this language that this voice speaks. So I think my question that I'm wondering about your thoughts on is, if voice, speech, language are no longer exclusively human traits. How do they enable a different kind of understanding of many things, of intelligence, of consciousness, of many things, but at the core of it, the very big things, such as what it means to be human. If we base that idea of what it is to be human on language, on our ability to have language, to be a speaking animal, and we're not the only ones who speak, other things speak. And of course the spiritual and death and what else speaks, what else is there that is not visible, that is not perceptible, also comes to this question, So the non-human again, in relation to voice and language. I wonder if you had any thoughts, since you are dealing with these voices as well from, this synthetic.
Yeah. I mean, I would. Yeah, in order to think of, I have a hard time thinking of humans as not. I have a hard time thinking that just because we can build a machine that can make sounds similar to what our vocal tracks are able to make, I have a hard time believing that is enough of a occurrence or enough of a monumental thing to say that we're still not the one who speaks. I think we or human ingenuity and engineering creates an object that is in our image, or is an extension, or is an extrapolation of ideas and things that we maybe assign value to. So probably the sounds that we assign the most value to are the sounds of human voices, I would think. Evolutionarily, maybe also the sounds of tigers and things that might try to kill us. babies crying, maybe. So yeah, I mean, that would be my initial thought, because I tend not to think of, I tend not to get down the road of thinking of technologies as being alien. I, for a very short period of time, was really wonderful. I was teaching at a media school in Hamburg, and I was teaching a course. I called it Computational Ontology, which is basically let's build computers with our hands and not think with our heads so much. And at one point I asked the question, like, can computers be intelligent? Just as like an open question for a discussion with the students. And what kind of intelligence is artificial intelligence, if it is intelligent? And one of my students said something along the lines of, well, it's just a certain kind of human intelligence that's been built into a machine. And I thought this was actually, like, as simple as this was, I thought it was quite profound in terms of the way I think about this narrative of thinking of technology as alien or other. I really can't. I have a hard time if we want to, because of a number of reasons. Because it's completely within the realm of human understanding, and I think for something to be truly alien, it really needs to be outside of the grasp of human understanding. And I think then it becomes interesting to look at non-human communication, because there you get into this kind of like, what is it like to be a bat situation, where we simply don't have the perceptual capabilities of even knowing where to begin to understand what kind of communication could be going on between, even, I mean, you said bacteria, even between bacteria, there's probably levels of communication and experience that we don't have access to, and probably never will.
Yeah, but I think it's rather than yes, of course, that debate of where it's all man-made. It's not, there's nothing. I mean, I'm interested in other accounts of it, actually, such as Luciana Parisi's ideas of computational, of algorithmic thinking, as in something that there's more to than what the values that we place on it. Exactly what you say, something that brings something else to the table. And I think that has value conceptually, even if we agree that, okay, that was made ultimately by an engineer, it helps us think, maybe in this occasion, maybe that's what I mean, about voice without language, as in listening to this voice, that doesn't have language. In the same way that, lamenting and folk music and singing together is not always about meaning, right? It's not about meaning. It's about, these utterances and vocalities that are outside the level of language and of representation and of meaning.
Yeah.
And what value do they, traditionally they've been assigned no value, right? They've been marginalized and kind of excluded from the historical record as not rational and therefore not counting. And I'm just thinking that, rethinking what matters from the point of view of the irrational, which can be this kind of spiritual, ritualistic thing. You said something really interesting when we spoke the other day, that there's nothing more powerful than humans singing together as one, right? Like that can cause an altered state. It's something is happening there, and I'm interested in that. And again, and not from a spiritual standpoint either. So it's not about choosing the rational, the computational, that logic over the spiritual, more new age ideas. So I think there's something else that is interesting, like gray area.
There's something very functional about it, also. I think. I mean, there's a reason why singing together touches us so much. I mean, I think it's probably one of the initial forms of music, that and maybe drumming together, right? And these two activities, singing together and drumming together, have been shown in neuroscience literature to create almost like altered states of consciousness where the self starts to dissolve. Like, the term is ego death. They can induce states of ego death where the boundary between oneself and other disappear. And it's particularly in these, like it's strongest in these forms, in collective drumming and collective singing. So I think there's something very, like, music has been used for ages as a way of coordinating labor, either singing together or banging something together, right? I mean, I think there's something very just fundamental psychologically powerful about these kind of collective musicking processes. And I also share your fascination in, well, what is there maybe undiscovered in these practices that could be discovered through using like more deep learning kind of approaches? Because deep learning approaches, I think from a creative perspective, I really grapple a lot because, yeah, there's so much hype around it, right? And especially for someone, well, like people like us who are really in this community of people who are creative people, but also really within like kind of a technological discursive environment where we're being creative with new tools and reflecting on new tools and technologies. There's this every time something becomes hyped usually by industry, right? We have to deal with it. It's like Dick Reimakers said, electronic music has no precedence in music. It came like a bolt from the blue out of nowhere, and we had to figure out what to do with it. So it's a bit like I've quite embraced this position as an artistic position. It's like, yeah, okay, throw the new piece of wood at me, and I'll try to build a lute out of it. But at the same time, there's a process of thinking, well, why would any musician want this? Why would any human want this? And that's been something I've been grappling with deep learning for the last few years. And I think one of the things that I am finding is very, very fruitful is exactly like this clip you played, where the representational categories that maybe we've learned can get broken down by the system that has built some sort of representational space of the data that you've given it, the recordings or whatever, and then can kind of reach spaces where, like, the symbolic logic, let's say in the case of language, the symbolic logic breaks down. And in the process of that, it kind of breaks down your own gestalts and possibly liberates something. So I think I really feel that connection, that there is something there. I don't know what it is yet, but working with choirs is really attractive.
Yes.
For some reason.
Yeah. You did mention Bazooka's interest in the mindfuck when we
Yes.
talked before.
I love I love mindfucks.
It's a brilliant quote. It's a brilliant quote. But now that you just you mentioned electronic music, and before the relationship between voice and death, and I was reminded of Delia Derbyshire, saying, who was an electronic musician pioneer, of course, and said that her interest in electronic music came from as a child. She was a child during the Second World War, and of course all she could hear was kind of sirens and bombings, and these which ultimately connected to death, and that for her was music. That was her music. That became the music that she made. Electronic music and death are also connected. But since you talked about perception, should we open that up a little bit more? I think we have a little bit more time, because
Sure.
we talked about kind of prediction. Prediction is at the center of your project, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
And yeah,
Well, I think at many levels, right? I think, well, when I started reading a lot of literature about long-term thinking and more of this kind of long-termism or whatever the counter is to this kind of very short-term um, social media inflamed society we live in the moment. Um, a lot of this, a lot of what we think about when we think about future being a future ancestor, right? Is what our behavior, what the results of our behavior will be for unborn generations, and to be able to even think about what the effects of your decisions will be, you have to have quite a good prediction, right? You have to have a good mechanism for predicting the future, at least in the hopes that you can make the best decision possible based on whatever it is that you know to be true at the time. And I think this idea of prediction is really something that I started digging deeper into, and also because I just tend to be very interested in psychology. Um, uh, I started getting into this theory of it's a neuroscientific theory called predictive processing. It's one of like kind of the very in vogue, I'll say, theories of mind at the moment. And basically, the idea is that rather than your perception of the world being some sort of direct sensory stream that's being fed to you from the outside, your experience of the world is completely generated within your brain, and your brain is projecting its idea of reality onto the outside world, and then trying to correct any mistakes or any errors in its prediction by what's coming in, which is it's a super complex theory, and I don't want to claim to be a neuroscientist and to say that I can explain it perfectly. But I just find this idea of prediction at every level being very interesting, and that just to be able to walk or run, when you're running, you're constantly off balance, and somehow you're able to be predicting all the time based on some model. But if your expectations are wrong, you'll fall over, right? So you have to be adaptive. You have to be corrective. You have to be always attentive. And I find this to be just a very powerful way of thinking about, how we act, how to act, and how to behave, and also just to be a little bit more kind of forgiving of the fact that you can't always be right, and you can very often fail terribly. And I try to also bake that into this project. I mean, I tend to like you said. I really love the mind fuck that Woody Fasulka was talking about. I really love situations where I can kind of create the mind fuck, but I also like situations where failure becomes an aesthetic fountain, so to speak. And I find that's especially true with deep learning technologies, deep learning approaches, because I find they're the most interesting when they fail, or fail. Fail is kind of like a weird idea, because actually, what is failure if you have a generative system? Like is a GAN failing when it's producing something that doesn't look like a cat? Well, maybe for Google, but for all of the hundreds of artists using GANs to make visuals, I mean, what they want is it not to look like a cat, but to look like some kind of crazy cat Salvador Dali painting.
Yeah. It's interesting because this is that because this idea of controlled hallucination that you talked about just now, right? That there is a level of controlled hallucination, which is what perception is, coming from the inside out as much as it's coming from the outside in, maybe even more, as you said, and guesswork and failure.
Yeah.
And and that in relation to what else there is, I think is very interesting, as in, what other language, the things that we were talking about before, what else is there other than the experience that we all agree that we are hallucinating at the moment, and we call reality, with,
Yeah.
Philip K. Dick talked about this if space, right? This between the consensus ad idem, what is known, and the more unreal dimensions, what is not actualized, what is speculative. There's so many different, Metzinger with his theory of the no self of the tunnel. There's so many interesting things, but maybe one of the more interesting things is this, in this prediction and predictive processes, is the oracle that you that you talked about, and how it's about the distinction between true and false as well in many ways. I was thinking when you were saying that about French philosopher Gilles Deleuze's idea following Nietzsche that the true world does not exist. And even if it did, it would be inaccessible and impossible to describe. And so you think, he talked about the power. It's a very long conversation. It has to do with time and his philosophy of time. And of course, he writes in the cinema books. But I'm very interested in the powers of the false that he talked about. And for him, it was in relation to cinema. And in the cinema taking up the problem of truth and attempting to resolve it with cinematic means, and by producing new realities, not just mimesis, not just representation, but the presentation of something that is not directly perceivable. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's part of the real on an equal level, just not currently lived. And of course, this idea that if cinema can do this, I was wondering if you could think about this in relation to your project. AI as a cultural object, these ideas of what it can be, what new realities maybe also it produces. What indiscernibilities it creates between real and imaginary, and not AI as a technology, but more this broadcaster, this idea of this artificial broadcaster.
I really would need to give some thought to that. That is a really.
But just to simplify, in relation to prediction and perception. So we both, I think, share this understanding that it's not as simple as black and white, and it's not a simple dichotomy between true and false. And what else is there in that if space in between that can be taken to be false or non-real, but we agree that actually it's just another level that is not available to us all of the time. For example, were you interested in that work as a programmer?
I think it is quite interesting. I'm very interested in perceptual research lately, and particularly like we've said in our previous conversations, this way that kind of precepts or categories or like perception of objects kind of are formed within our heads, and I guess this really comes to the fore when you start working with speech, because speech has so many different levels of intelligibility and interpretability, and it's so wrapped up in expectation. Because if you're listening to somebody speak, a lot of what your brain is usually doing is predicting what's going to come next, and you just hear what's going to come next. This is how we're able, because speech is very redundant in information theory terminologies, right? There's actually a huge redundance of information in me talking to you right now. You could do with a lot less information, a lot less sound, a lot less everything, and you would still be able to get the message that I'm trying to kind of like broadcast to you. Mm-hmm. And because of this redundancy, we're able to kind of extrapolate all kinds of things based on our expectations. So it's very interesting to me if you could somehow use AI systems to kind of buck those expectations a bit, or even show that these expectations are happening. I would really, actually, I mean, it's that you bring this up. I would really love to play this fragment of sound from the speech by Anil Seth. So full disclosure, I just started a PhD, and I'm kind of like half doing music composition and half hanging out with a bunch of neuroscientists at the University of Sussex, which is incredible. And I'm mainly hanging out in the lab of a researcher named Anil Seth, which is he researches consciousness, and particularly this idea of like the shared controlled hallucination being the source of consciousness is something that he's a big proponent of. So he gave a really wonderful TED talk where he gives a great example of predictive processing at work. And basically what he does is he plays a sound to you, and then he asks you if you can hear a voice in that sound. So maybe we can play that one and give everybody a little bit of a kind of real example of how this dynamic works. So it's number 18.
Here's one more example, which shows just how quickly the brain can use new predictions to change what we consciously experience. Have a listen to this. Sounded strange, right? Have a listen again and see if you can get anything.
Idea.
Which I do. So you heard some words there, right? Now listen to the first sound again. I'm just going to replay it.
So, I mean, this example shows you how much, from a very low level, how much of your reality is constructed by your expectations. And I think why not explore this as an artistic, explore this artistically? Because maybe there's a potential of discovering something new by understanding where these expectations come from and maybe breaking them a little bit. I think especially now in a time where, I mean, it was like you said, the decay of the Western Empire, and everybody is looking for new stories. I think some of those stories are also happening at the neurological level, right? So we also need tactics for retelling those stories, and I think that's kind of what I'm interested in now, and also a little bit what's kind of inspiring some of the aesthetic approaches that I'm using in the voice synthesis in this broadcast.
Can you talk or play something more from that about, in relation to the aesthetic approach?
Yeah, of course. So maybe something interesting. So I'm using a number of different algorithms, but maybe something interesting that I could play is so I've been very happily working with a machine learning model developed by a researcher at IRCAM named Antoine Callillon, and it's called Rave. It's quite bloody technology, I will say, at the moment, in the sense that it's very alpha level, but he's working on it really quickly, and I think it's something that's really wonderful for artists. It will be really wonderful for artists once it's really off the ground. And what it does is it allows you to kind of train a model with a collection of audio that you've gathered. And what you can do is you can feed new audio into it, and it will try to do almost like a corpus-based matching of what you feed into it, so that what comes out uses a lot of the acoustic signatures of what you've put into it and gives it to you in that mode. So I've trained Rave models on collections of animal samples that I have, on bird songs, on 90s rap acapellas from like some of my favorite rap songs from the 90s, on British choral singing. And this is kind of a technique that I'm going to be using a lot over the coming months in the stream. So we can give a listen to what this sounds like. This is a recording with a few of these models morphing a woman singing her ABC song, the alphabet song, from human speech to animal sounds to bird song to choir singing, I think, to a data set of 109 different people's voices. So it's a bit wild. But let's give it a listen. It's number 5.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. Now I know my ABC. Next time, won't you sing with me? Now I know my ABC. Next time, won't you sing with me?
Wow, that's incredible, isn't it? That's really incredible. It was kind of, it had like a Hal moment, didn't it? Where he was disintegrating just before he died, and then it picked up on this kind of the harmony, and so it felt to me like it was kind of drifting between the horror of human existing, or of existence, and then kind of some hope was piercing through, which interestingly I think is part of this of, you know, in relation to death that we talked about before, and and tragedy and ancient, and lamenting and ancient tragedy. You know, this is it's because it's not one voice. There is a collective going on, and it's this kind of, there is a chorus. And so the act of this kind of the individual submerging their identity in the chorus, in order to come to terms with the drama of the agonizing drama of existence, is the birth of tragedy, Nietzsche. Yeah, but that's what it sounded like to me. Really interesting. What is it? What is it for you?
I love that. I love that reading of it. What is it to me? Yeah. To me, it's to me, it's. I mean, in this case, I really am looking to explore this kind of slow change from perceptibility to imperceptibility, and yeah, the beauty of being able to be consumed in that, like to give enough time to disappear, so to say. I like this idea. I mean, maybe it is connected to your interpretation of like wanting to give your voice to the choir so that you can disappear. But it's giving your voice to a choir that's maybe much bigger than the time span of a human life, of a single human life. And whether that's necessarily a collective or not, I'm not sure. I think that might be something that will emerge during the workshops also, because that's really where this becomes a bit more of a collective work, because then people will be able to contribute not only with words but also with their own voices. And yeah, who knows? I mean, the workshop, when we do it in person in Berlin, we'll hopefully have some kind of recording equipment around. So maybe we will end up at the end of the year with some kind of chorus of voices of people who have donated their vocal signature to the choir.
Yes, that's really interesting, and I definitely think that you should. It's a good chance to mention these workshops that seem amazing, that are coming up, and that I'm definitely going to participate in as many as I can. Would you like
Amazing!
to?
I really hope you can make it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it seems like the core of the work in many ways as well that will happen there, right?
It is a core of the work. I think getting all of this crazy technology to work in the first place was a big part of it.
sorry, John, of course.
Once we have ground to stand on, then it really becomes all about the process. And I think that's how the process evolves, is through these workshops. So yeah, I mean, the first one is already announced and open for registrations. It'll be on March the 12th. And I'll be working together with an amazing group of artists from Rotterdam, part of the collective Varia, who have been working with kind of creative collective strategies for reading together, but also writing and annotating text. I co-curate and co-organize an event series called The Reading Room, which is basically like an opportunity that we use to kind of get together and read difficult texts for artists and normal people, let's say, like mere mortals trying to read heavy duty theory. And we had Varia as the guest readers for the last session, and we did a reading session fully in Etherpad, which is this kind of collaborative text editing tool. And it was so much nicer than all of the Zoom calls we've been on lately, because it's everybody can type at the same time. It's completely asynchronous. So you have this kind of weaving together of everybody's ideas always at the same time. And it was just a really beautiful process. So I'm really excited in the first workshop that we're going to kind of bring this to looking at the text that the broadcaster is reading and finding a kind of a process of annotating those texts so that it will read differently in the future, hopefully in a way that we want it to. We'll see.
No, let go.
Let's just let it go. One of many possible preferable futures. So there will be 3 workshops throughout the year. The other one will be in person in Berlin during CTM Fest. And then the last one will be in the fall. So both of those will be announced with official dates and things relatively soon. But right now we've got the March 12th one on the horizon that we're getting ready for.
Fantastic. It sounds brilliant. I'm definitely joining you. And we have a little bit of time left, and I I don't know if there's any questions from anyone out there. Maybe that it takes a bit of time to for all of this to sink in. It always takes a bit of time for the audience, doesn't it? But I wondered if you, while we maybe wait to hear if there is anyone with a specific question, if you could talk a little bit about this process of stewardship, because I almost took it from you and said, oh, it's the core of the work, when I a core, which is absolutely right. So the other part that seems the other part that seems very important is this process of stewardship. I'm really interested in how you see this, in this long-term project.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I've been grappling with a lot in general. With again, this kind of situation that we're in as creative people who are tasked with kind of digesting new technological developments, is kind of it's I have to say it's very emotionally challenging to work with AI, with like deep learning, as an artist, for me at least, because I have like a kind of grown kind of ethical standpoint, and it just seems like every element of deep learning as it's done today is rotten. From the infrastructure to the deployment, the ones funding it, not everybody funding it, of course, but because I mean, of course, it's also being used for very, very altruistic purposes. I mean, it gets used for whatever you use it for. But it does seem like one of these things where the risks outweigh the benefits with a lot of what's going on in terms of me being a contributor to deep learning research, in the sense of, what if I build a better speech synthesis algorithm? What does that mean? I mean, I since I started this PhD, I've been doing all kinds of courses in deep learning, and sometimes you'll have like a 2-hour lecture, and then there'll be like a little 5-minute clip about ethics, which is usually quite damning. Like, oh, it's destabilizing elections. It's being used for mass surveillance. It's being used to power automatic weaponry. And then you watch this ethics thing, and then the course just goes on. It's like, all right, now here's how you use it in a Jupyter notebook. and when I witness this, I'm just a little bit like, oh my God, in a sense, it's part of my work to use these technologies and do something hopefully poetic with them. But on the other hand, it's like, what do you do with it? And I've been kind of tossing around this idea of like convivial technology. Like what would a convivial, coming from this idea of even Eldridge, where he talks about this idea of convivial tools, which are basically technologies that improve things like social cohesion, personal value in a society, these kind of things that make people happier and supposedly like live a better life. And so I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of deep learning systems. And I started thinking, okay, well, what would be like a convivial approach to deep learning? And I think a lot of it has to do with the data, where the data comes from, who gets to work with the data, and the need to not get to a fixed point. And I think this is a challenge of deep learning, because some company like OpenAI will spend ungodly amounts of resources and time training some massive model like GPT-3. And then that GPT-3 model is like a fixed object because it takes so much to train it. And that's really, for me, that's super problematic. Besides the fact that, I as a musician just want to have a more dynamic relationship with my tools. The fact that you're kind of freezing knowledge, or freezing, not even knowledge, but like whatever the heck it is that these deep learning systems are, They're like performative knowledge, like knowledge that can act in the world on its own volition, and to make that such a monolithic thing without a process of stewardship, I find very it's very troubling. And so this work, being given this gift of being able to kind of modulate a radio stream 24/7 for a whole year, it seems like a great opportunity, because there has to be stewardship anyway, just to keep the darn thing going. So it seems like an ideal opportunity to like put this hypothesis into practice and say, like, okay, what if we try to kind of collectively steward some deep learning systems, and see what it does for a while, and then as part of the practice come back to it and convene around it and reevaluate and maybe try to push it in a little bit different direction. I mean, this is part of the prediction idea of prediction also. Predictions as reality comes closer and closer to you in each moment. So yeah, I think that's where this idea of stewardship comes from.
It's very interesting. Also, as not just a one-man job, the stewardship, because what happens. I was thinking of Jem Finer, in his project Long Player. That's a 1,000-year long installation, a sound installation, and who else takes on this stewardship? What happens with the technology? How if you stretch it far out in time in the future to the future ancestors. Who has responsibility for that is interesting. But we do have a question for you, John, and I believe we have a bit of time. And somebody's asking, can you elaborate a bit more on the compositional process behind the work? How have the generated texts and voices been put together to form a continuous composition?
Okay, it's a good question. So returning again to this idea of prediction. So the closest, you mentioned the oracle, which I think you can say a lot more about than I could. But I think the closest thing that we have to kind of an oracle that, the royalty or the wealthy elites would go to consult to figure out what to do with their money, or to go to war, or to whatever. I think the closest thing we have to that today are prediction algorithms. These are kind of forecasting algorithms. They're simulations mostly, used in everything from predicting economies to predicting social behavior to predicting ecological collapse. Probably the most famous prediction algorithms are weather forecast algorithms. And these algorithms are complex dynamic systems. And usually they're represented by some insanely complex differential equations that can't be solved analytically. And what that means is that they can't be solved by symbolic manipulation alone. You actually have to run the equation through time, or through simulated time, because usually you're speeding up time quite a bit. And of course, this is what chaos theory is kind of about also, is that you can run these simulations starting with some initial conditions. And as you go through the simulation, at some point, things start to become beyond a certain threshold of predictability. So there's a limit to what we can predict, which is the formal definition of that. There's a limit to what we can predict. So I found this really interesting, because I was thinking compositionally really of stochastic systems, or let's use some kind of Markov chains or something like this, with some kind of handcrafted rules, because of course you want to have some sort of human intervention. At least I do. I haven't completely lost faith in my own abilities to create something beautiful. But a mentor of mine, her name is Alice Eldridge. She's a really wonderful composer, also from the UK, who's done a lot with using these sort of complex dynamic systems for generative compositions. And she really got me on the track of thinking, well, you could use these dynamic systems as compositional processes. And I was like, really? But I mean, in composition, you need discrete things to happen. And she's like, no, there's all kinds of ways, all kinds of ways. So she kind of like gave me a little impromptu tutorial and really got me down that track. And I thought poetically it made a lot of sense to try using these systems as the compositional drivers behind when text happens or when text gets morphed or warped in a certain way, when it becomes birdsong. So I've been working on creating this kind of zoo of simulation algorithms, and right now there's only 2 of them running on there. It's very simple, so it's again like everything else in the project, it will kind of grow during the year. Right now I have quite famous equations called the Lotka-Voltaire equations, which are used to simulate population dynamics within an ecosystem. So like foxes and rabbits, or the rabbits breed and then the foxes have more rabbits to eat, so there's more foxes, and then they eat too many of the rabbits and the rabbits decline, the foxes decline, so on and so forth. And the other one is something called a Kuromoto Oscillator, which comes from research into simulations of the human brain. Because it's an oscillator, or a system of coupled oscillators that show synchronicity and asynchronicity at the same time. And this phenomenon of being synchronous and asynchronous at the same time is one of the theories of kind of what's going on in our brains that allows us to be anything at all. Not complete noise versus complete silence, but something kind of just chaotic enough to create a living and breathing human being. So these are the 2 things that are kind of generally driving the composition at the moment.
Great, thank you. There is one more question. I don't know, Jan, if you think that we have enough time for it. I can see it's 27 past. Shall I ask it? I don't know if it can be answered quickly, but I'll hit you with it, and you have 3 minutes to respond.
Okay.
Are there? This is by Tobias Bauer. Are there images that are important for your work with voice and sound?
Images. Oh wow, that's really interesting. Ooh.
Yep, 2 minutes. You've got.
Wow. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, to be perfectly honest. I don't have. Let me think for a second. Do I have an answer to that? No, I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's an interesting question, because I've never asked myself, do I use images in my compositional processes, or do I like allow images to drive my compositional processes, or my music in general? And I have to say no. And I think part of that is because so much of my work, I try to get away from screens, and I try to get away from visual representations, because for me that's where I feel musical, is when I've kind of gotten away. Maybe actually my not using of images is actually very, very speaks a lot about my approach to voice and artificial voice, because I'm trying to get so anti-symbolic in a way, and away from the kind of representational, phenomenology of images, of words, which for me are very closely related, I think, in the way that I experience the world. So really interesting question. Thanks.
I mean, I think the flourishing of kind of sound art and sound studies and sonic thinking and sonic fiction and all of this stuff came almost as an antidote. It did develop initially as a different way of thinking, especially in going beyond representation. But I mean, it's not. Then the fetishism of that is another story that we might have to leave for our for our next sonic fetishism.
Deal. Next discussion, sonic fetishism.
Thank you so much, John. I think I should kind of stop here and thank you so much for this conversation, and look forward to more. And
likewise, thank you so much, Eleni, and thank you, Jan, and everyone at CTM. This again, it's really an honor.
Yes, and I wanted to quickly thank you also, Jan and Berit and Amelie and Taisa and Ranav, who's backstage. Over to you, Jan.
Yeah, thank you. Not sure if I'm in the picture, but maybe you can hear me. Oh yeah, here I am. Well, thank you so much for this very informative talk. I actually had noted quite a big question to myself, but I think I'm not going to ask it now because we're already a bit late in time. But it certainly triggered a lot of thoughts for me, and I'm very curious how this project evolves. And I'm also looking forward to the workshop and hope to be a part of that. And I hope other people who follow us here on YouTube will do. Yeah, and that just leaves me to say, come back to the festival latest in May when we do our second part. And again, express my gratitude to the two of you, Eleni and Jonathan. And yeah, have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. And tune in to John's project. Tune in.
Absolutely. Ahnen.in is the URL. Okay. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Good.